speaker. Our speaker today is Mr. Landon Grove. Landon is the director and curator of the Ritchie History Museum in Cascades, Maryland. Landon is the first director and curator for the museum. I think he's been with them since they started in 2011. 2021, okay. And I believe the museum just recently opened to the public and is about 75 miles north of here. So it's an easy day trip for anyone living in the DMV. There are two intersections, I think, between the Japanese-American soldiers and the soldiers that were trained at Camp Ritchie. The first is that they were the counterpart to what the MIS did in the Pacific. As I understand it, the soldiers at Camp Ritchie were trained in French, German, and Italian to do similar work in Europe. The other intersection is I understand that about 500 MIS either were trained or stationed at Camp Ritchie. So there's an intersection not only of work, but of personnel. So, and we have Allison Grove, who is here. We welcome her as well. So let's welcome Landon to the podium and hear about Camp Ritchie.
Love it.
Thank you for that introduction. There we go. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for welcoming my wife and I. It's always good to be in Washington, D.C. Today I hope you'll learn a great deal about Camp Ritchie, the Ritchie Boys, and the hundreds of Nisei soldiers who came there in 1944 and 1945 to support the efforts of ending the war in the Pacific. You go into public history because you absolutely love the places that you are, and you take seriously the stewardship that comes with that. And today, I'm happy to share with you a history that I am proud to help safeguard. And that's the story of the Ritchie Boys of World War II and how their training at Camp Ritchie, Maryland helped end the war in both theaters. To understand the Ritchie Boys, you have to first understand the multiple layers of their existence and how they came to be thrust in the national limelight recently, and in many ways by total chance. For many, even some family members, the story of Camp Ritchie and its recruits' overseas assignments were rarely discussed because of its top secret classification, and for decades their work wasn't discussed. What's most extraordinary about this group is nearly all of them were conversant in multiple languages. Over 2,800 of them were German and Austrian-born Jews who fled their homeland, came to America, and joined the United States Army. And over 500 of these Ritchie boys and Ritchie girls were Nisei, who utilized their language skills just as the European Ritchie boys did to translate documents, interrogate prisoners, and make massive contributions to the war effort. Second. Okay, there we go. Much like the story of the Ritchie boys, Camp Ritchie, the Army's Military Intelligence Training Center, was nearly forgotten to time as well. During the 1990s, the federal government closed dozens of military installations to save federal funding. And Camp Ritchie, at that point, which had been renamed Fort Ritchie, was closed in 1998 and abandoned. The property was owned by several groups who did very little to preserve the historic integrity of the site. And as a result, these buildings were vandalized, and many of them taken past the point of no return. Ultimately, many World War II era structures were demolished. You can look at these ruins as memory, a connection to the past. Once it was a thriving army post with 2,500 civilian and military workers, perhaps the most important installation during World War II to producing soldiers trained in intelligence gathering, and then it became a monument in ruin, forgotten, collapsing in on over 70 years of military history. And now it's a place of revitalization and hope for the small community of Cascade, Maryland. This site, like most historical sites, is alive and ever-changing. Families of departed soldiers want to bond with it, and they use it to cultivate family relationships with new information. My dad ate in this mess hall. My father learned how to fire a rifle in the parade ground. My uncle marched over here. All of these are conversations that I've had with Ritchie Boy families. Historical sites don't ever really die. They sometimes go dormant or hibernate, ready for someone or something to breathe life back into it. And the same can be said of the story of the Ritchie Boys. The 2004 documentary highlighted the plight of 10 Jewish men who escaped certain death, only to return to do what they knew with every fiber of their being was the right thing to do. Then the story hibernated for over 15 years, and now their outsized contributions of these soldiers made in defeating Hitler and his army have once again awakened, but this time to great fanfare and recognition. How did Camp Ritchie become the place where these soldiers trained? In 1926, the Maryland National Guard was searching for a summer training camp and ultimately decided on the grounds of an old ice company. The work commenced in 1926 with some breaks during the Great Depression. Most of the buildings were finished in 1935 with the help of Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration. The engineer of the property, right there, a promising World War I officer, Robert Barrick, was selected as engineer of the property. Interestingly, Barrick only had a 7th grade education and no architectural or engineering experience whatsoever. He only learned how to create these buildings by reading books in his spare time. Most every stone building devised by Barrick still stands today. The first year, the National Guard used only tents, but with the help of $5 million in funding, today equal to $86 million, the Guard was able to build over 50 permanent stone structures. The site was hidden perfectly in a high valley in the Blue Ridge Mountains, contained 2 large lakes, interesting terrain, and was only 70 miles from Washington, D.C., geographic traits which later supported the Army's decision for selecting the property for military intelligence training. The National Guard continued its operations until the beginning of World War II. With the attack on Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entrance into the war, the military determined the need for intelligence agents, a group that was essentially non-existent during World War I. On June 19, 1942, the Army took over Camp Ritchie and created the Military Intelligence Training Center, the Army's central training ground for intelligence. But it soon became apparent, however, that the need for interrogating prisoners of war in Europe was great. Yet there was a gap in those who knew the language fluently. After some delay in enlisting immigrants and refugees who were at that time considered enemy aliens by the U.S. government, the language skills for translating were taken into consideration and became highly sought after. The Ritchie Boys were an elite group of military intelligence officers and enlisted men who trained in, among other things, psychological warfare, Morse code, and aerial reconnaissance. The Ritchie Boys arrived just in time to turn the tide in the war. It was at Camp Ritchie where these soldiers would hone in their skills, and many of them entered the war on D-Day. They were not just good at languages, and they were not just smart. Army reports indicate that about 60% of the actionable intelligence gathered in the European theater was made possible by the Ritchie Boys. About 15% of the Ritchie Boys, over 2,800 refugees of the Holocaust, were responsible for these incredible successes. These soldiers knew that if their Jewish backgrounds were discovered, they would be killed in spite of the Geneva Convention rules, and 2 Ritchie boys were summarily executed because their dog tags didn't indicate that they were Jewish. It's for this reason that many Ritchie boys decided not to have the letter H placed on their dog tag, which symbolizes Hebrew. They instead often chose to leave it blank or simply select a different religion like Protestant. While 60% of these men were American citizens, many of their parents had immigrated to the United States a generation before. Even more interesting were the other 40% of Ritchie boys who came from nearly every corner of the world, 70 countries in all, though most came from Europe. During this period, it was not unusual for local farmers to see men racing through their fields in the dead of night, sometimes dressed in Nazi and Japanese garb uniforms to make the trainings more realistic. After this first group, which was comprised of only 32 graduates, some of whom watched their families die at the hands of the enemy, the number of recruits exploded into the hundreds. At any given time, between 1942 and 1945, a class of soldiers nearing 600 to 800 walked the grounds of Camp Ritchie. With the nature of World War II and many of the Ritchie boys being intimately familiar with the situation in the European theater, the Army could not have possibly created a more ingenious plan to utilize the skills of immigrants. These European-born Jewish soldiers were not only well familiar with the culture of the enemy, but also their language, traditions, and general way of thinking, not to mention the prospect of getting some revenge on Hitler. As Ritchie boy Paul Fairbrook said, "There's nothing I wanted more than to get revenge on Hitler, who killed my aunts and uncles and cousins." Language became the most important component at Camp Ritchie. And to emphasize the language component of Camp Ritchie, I'd also like to emphasize that the Ritchie boys and some 200 Ritchie girls came from all backgrounds. Future entrepreneur David Rockefeller was a Ritchie boy and spoke fluent French. J.D. Salinger, who penned Catcher in the Rye, supposedly portions of which was stationed at Camp Ritchie. Archibald Roosevelt, the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, was well versed in over 20 languages and in Ritchie's 10th class. There are at least 10 known future U.S. diplomats who served at Ritchie. John Kluge, to continue on, who was at one time the wealthiest man in the United States and funded about half of the Library of Congress. Several future politicians, including Idaho Senator Frank Church and opera singer William Warfield, who's most famous for singing Old Man River in the movie Showboat, was one of only 48 African-American Ritchie boys. The inventor of the video game console, the founder of Waffle House, was also a Ritchie boy. Among the Ritchie girls, Jer Knight, who penned Lassie Come Home, and also a speechwriter for President Dwight Eisenhower. Prominent wrestler Man Mountain Dean, the Baltimore Colts founder Bob Rodenberg, Wilbur Shee, the first Chinese American commissioned as an officer in the United States Marine Corps, and Vernon Walters, at one time the deputy director of the CIA. And this is just a short list of many Ritchie notables. While the Jewish Ritchie boys have very compelling stories from this time, it should be noted that Camp Ritchie harbored every conceivable, and in some cases inconceivable, kind of immigrant. Without listing them all, there were barracks housing Russians, Germans, French, Italians, Spanish, Indians, American and Hindu, Icelanders, Laplanders, Mexicans, Albanians, Macedonians, Slovenians, Wends, Hungarians, Welsh, Algerians, Syrians, Turks, Georgians, Azerbaijanis, Uzbeks, Mongolians, and Chinese, just to list a few. And for the purpose of our talk today, I want to also highlight the Japanese Nisei. The following information was crafted and uncovered by my friend and colleague and fellow Ritchie researcher, Dr. Beverly Driver Eddy, who wrote a phenomenal book called Ritchie Boy Secrets. For the first generation Japanese born in the United States, Nisei, the American declaration of war against Japan made many of them subjects to suspicion and hostility. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Nisei found that nearly all armed forces induction centers refused to enlist them. After Roosevelt's executive order, which interred many Japanese into camps, the military soon did an about-face on the induction policies and began to recruit mainland Nisei. Many interviews were conducted through barbed wire fence, in which young men were essentially asked, "Are you willing to serve? And are you loyal to Uncle Sam?" At Camp Ritchie in the fall of 1944, the Army developed the PAC-MIRS program, the Pacific Military Intelligence Research Section. Naturally, Nisei were in high demand for this new organization, yet the Army set down rigid restrictions for them. These soldiers could not be commissioned as officers, nor could they fight in the Pacific Theater. Many of the Nisei set to work in a warehouse that formerly held Italian prisoners of war. though some worked in large white barracks and others still in the original stone buildings created by Barrack. Colonel Siegfried Gronich was the first chief of Packmeers, formerly an instructor of the Ritchie boys. Gronich served in North Africa, where he was wounded in Algiers and parachuted into Italy. One Ritchie Nisei said of Gronich, he was a rough and tough regular army guy. In his first meeting, Gronich said to the Nisei, "A great deal is going to be expected of you. You'll be asked to work far beyond your rank. Some of you certainly deserve commissions, all of you higher rankings. I wish I could give you what you deserve, but I cannot. I'm in no position to do so, but this isn't going to keep me from asking you to do exactly what I feel each of you is capable of doing." It wasn't long before this challenge was met. Kazuo Yamane, seen on the left, found a gem in what was seemingly a pile of garbage. As he was trained in linguistics in a Japanese university, he was able to read multiple levels of text. 15 crates of documents stamped no military significance that had been captured by the U.S. Navy in Saipan, were sent to Ritchie for training purposes. During the analyzation, Yamane came across a book that was badly beaten and water-stained. As he opened the table of contents, he first believed it to be a textbook. Yamane saw at once, however, that it was far more than that. It was a listing of very top-secret information. It listed the manufacturers of Japanese weapons. It listed the munitions plants. It gave you the address. It listed an inventory of what they had and whether they had spare parts, how many they had. Every weapon the Japanese army had was listed. After half an hour, I knew this was a very hot document, he said. Yamane went to the commander, who immediately contacted the War Department, which translated the entire document and provided aerial targeting to the Allies, who quickly set to work taking out each location. It took 53 years, but eventually Yamane was awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptional conduct. Other notable Ritchie Nisei were Akira Itami, who organized the Packmeers Library and received the Legion of Merit in 1946, the only individual listed in the final Packmeers report for his incredible efforts. He was later the head translator of the Tokyo trials. Shiro Omata, to name another Ritchie notable, was General MacArthur's translator for 5 years. Among the Nisei women, Tami Tsushiyama, who before her time at Ritchie was the only Japanese-American woman to work full-time in the Japanese American evacuation and resettlement study. She became voluntarily incarcerated at a relocation center in southwest Arizona, where she recorded the details of the detainees in the camp. She kept her research top secret. Many of the Ritchie Nisei, most notably, were thrilled with their treatment in nearby Hagerstown, Maryland. While Hagerstown had the unfortunate distinction of being where African-American baseball player Willie Mays was turned away from a white hotel when the rest of the Trenton Giants were granted entry, the local USOs made it a point to ensure that treatment of the Nisei matched the decorum of any soldier. Glenn Morehouse, who headed up the USOs in the area, noted, "These troops were the first to land on the beaches of Anzio. Over 1,000 have received Purple Hearts. Call them Americans, call them Nisei, just don't mention race at all." Nisei John Fujioka was quoted as saying, "We were treated extremely well by the locals. It was good to know that most Americans in this area did not look at our race." Nisei were also very pleased with their living quarters at Ritchie. All menial duties were performed by prisoners of war. The food was tasty. The camp had 2 lakes for recreation, like boating and swimming. However, there were instances of racial disparities at Ritchie. For this story, I find it best to hear from Gordon Yamada, a Nisei who trained at Ritchie.
And we were ordered to Fort Ritchie, Maryland, and it was a counterintelligence school. That's where we first went into intelligence. And the whole point of it was we were all fitted up to wear Japanese uniforms. And we didn't know what the reason was at that time. And what we did was we wore Japanese leggings and shoes, the rubber shoes, and carried the Japanese rifles and had a Japanese helmet with a star on it. And I was one of the bigger guys, so they had a hard time finding a uniform to fit me, because these are all captured uniforms. And the point was that we were supposed to act like Japanese soldiers. And they were training us in Japanese and Japanese military commands. And having us do exercises, maneuvers around the lake in Fort Ritchie. And they told us at the time that what they were going to do is, I think there were 40 or 50 of us there, and they were going to use us as troops to take to the different basic training places to parade us around and show all of the other American troops that this is what your enemy looks like. And we couldn't believe what they were planning to do, but of course we were soldiers, so we had to follow orders. And I think there could have been a more ulterior motive in mind, because we had learned well enough, we could have been dropped behind the lines, I guess. But they didn't ever tell us that. After about 6 months of this, 4 months, maybe 4 months of this, I think the Army realized that we never looked like Japanese soldiers, really, because we didn't act like it. And then they disbanded the unit and shipped us to Fort Snelling for military language training.
Fast forward to 2022, when the new owner of Fort Ritchie, now a privately owned property, was looking in one of the dilapidated buildings to find a new use with myself, along with his wife. We walked into a stone structure with a roof caved in, graffiti littered on the interior, only to notice distinct color change under sheets of plywood affixed to the wall. Upon removing the plywood, we found a mural which was clearly painted to reflect Nisei art culture. Miraculously, the mural was in very good shape in spite of the conditions of the rest of the building. Eventually, the story of the mural's existence was picked up by the Baltimore Sun and landed on the front page. So here we are with the Sun removing some of the plywood off of the walls. The mural itself is about 12 foot by 4. And as I mentioned at dinner, the hole in the roof was about the size of one of the tables that we're eating at today. And so for many years it was exposed to snow and rain and all sorts of other elements, as well as vandalism. Yet the mural remained ultimately untouched, with the exception of some chipping on some of the paint. You can see the condition of the rest of the building. It was later picked up by the Washington Post, and the story traveled to many Japanese Americans group, which was ultimately picked up by one in a Minnesota Historical Society who had informed me of an art contest which was held among Nisei at Fort Snelling. The director of the society, Japanese American herself, informed me that this book, Soldier Art, which was produced in 1945, perhaps would have a clue to who the artist was. On page 130 of the book, there was a piece which had very similar composition to the mural which we had uncovered at Fort Ritchie. Its thick black lines, which do not affix to the subjects, was very similar to the mural at Ritchie. The artist of this book, Nobu Kitagaki, who sure enough was stationed at Ritchie as a Nisei working in pack mirrors. What's most miraculous about this work, I think, is one, the fact that it has stayed in such good condition for so long, but according to Kitagaki's nephew, who works for National Geographic as a photographer, he said, it sure looks a lot like Uncle Nob's work. And he also indicated that he was very thrilled that it's possible one of his artworks are still in existence in Western Maryland, as opposed to where he lived in Sacramento. I wanted to thank everyone for having me out today, and I wanted to especially thank Terry Shima, who has been working hard to try and raise funds to preserve the mural. To date, we've raised $7,000 to preserve the Nisei mural at Ritchie, which will be on full display when the building later this year is converted into an artisan village to display local arts throughout the community. As we continue to move forward, I hope to work with more donors to help restore the mural and the history of the Nisei at Camp Ritchie. Thank you very much.
Well, that was very, very interesting. Let's. I don't know if I can ask you to come forward. First of all, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. That is Java coin with your name and today's date.
Thank you.
Inscribed.
Thank you.
Also, gotta unpack this. On behalf of the Japanese American Veterans Association, we want to present you with this image of the Go for Broke stamp. Again, thank you very much.
If I might add, every letter we send to Camp Ritchie uses this stamp.
Thank you very much.
That's a big envelope you have.
Well, I'm sure all of us will take the time to journey that 75 miles to Camp Ritchie based upon Landon's speech today. It's very interesting. We really appreciate not only your time, but Ellison's time in sharing this time with us. I have a couple of announcements. The first, I'd like to call Neat Ford forward. All of you know Neat. She is our executive director. She gave me a near heart attack a couple of months ago when she called me to say that for personal reasons she needs to step down for as executive director. And Neat is a treasure. I mean, she has been, to the extent you think I've done a good job as president, it's only because Neat has propped me up and told me what to do. But she really has been a treasure to Java, really contributed. And so we really appreciate it. And although her resignation date was June 30th, she continues to assist until we find a new executive director. We really appreciate the generosity of her time. I've got something here for you, Neat. First, give you a coin. Thank you. Again, with your name, it's inscribed as executive director. The date is the 30th of June. And I dropped something here. We need to make sure it's that little suction cup. Anyway, the National Executive Council of Java has approved an award for Neat. It's our Book Clock Award, and it's inscribed Japanese American Veterans Association presents to Anita Neat Ford for exemplary and dedicated service as Java's executive director with our heartfelt appreciation. June 30th, 2023.
Wow, wow. Thank you so much.
So this is for you.
Wow. Thank you. Well, I'm so honored, and I'm not at all is that impromptu speaker? I had just
me the other week at around 10:30 at night, and he said, "What were your dates again that you used?" So last night, and I started thinking, I better write out some thoughts. And anyway, so I hope you'll forgive me if I read something. So I feel so incredibly fortunate to have worked side by side with all of you, and I mean all of you, the Executive Council, the JAVA members, the volunteers, the scholarship donors, the awardees, sister organization members, all of your family, and of course Terry Shima. The work has been both incredibly meaningful and fun. From the start, I just loved all the Hawaiian shirts and the words that were new to me. Mahalo, I don't have pronunciation, Gaman, but truly heaps of praise and thanks go to Gerald, who has been just a path-breaking leader, instituting the annual Day of Affirmation, but also incredibly pragmatic, kicking off JAVA's first annual fundraising campaign. And there are so many more things that he's done to improve and streamline JAVA operations and make my job so much easier. He has also been wonderfully tolerant of my many mistakes and failings along the way. Over the phone you don't see the hand wringing, but I'm sure Nancy did. And he's balanced, deliberate, calm, encouraging, which has just been a beautiful contrast to my usual mode of panic. And very willing to consider when I've offered a different point of view, and also very understanding and consoling during some personal challenges I've had. It's been a deep pleasure to work with you, Gerald. Each of you here have been endlessly kind and helpful, and always willing to lend a hand and do whatever needs to be done, and you've really made my job a joy. So in addition to all of this, learning the story of the World War II Nisei soldiers, the story has all the makings of a tall tale. I mean, regional, larger-than-life individuals, amazing feats, deathly struggle. But in the case of the Nisei, it's all true. The Nisei show me what it is to be an American, a nation based on ideals. Ones they lived up to. And once you know their story, it's really hard to complain about anything. You name it, the government, the weather, things not being fair, family in dire circumstances, anxiety and fear about the future. The Nisei experienced it all and took the high road. And I'm grateful to have their story as a lamppost. And I feel certain that JAVA's unwavering work to share and celebrate the Nisei soldiers' story will inspire more Americans to see and act differently with those ideals in mind. And lastly, I have to say that I just love this Camp Ritchie mural. The making of a craft during a war, of very troubled times. The images just speak to tenderness and care and hope. And so I find that just also inspiring to as well. So thank you very much. I will definitely treasure this, and just have really enjoyed my time.
Thank you, Neat. Terry called me and said, the dates she was executive director? And I said, well, she was, working with JAVA when I became president, so we kind of speculated. And he says, how sure are you? I said, why don't you call her? I didn't expect him to turn around and call you late at night. And so he spilled the beans, I guess. But anyway, it really has been, and I speak for not only everybody in this room, but our entire membership. Anyone that's worked with you has enjoyed and appreciated your contributions, your dedication, and your friendship. So we wish you well. We expect you to become a friend of JAVA and see you at all our events. JAVA. one final announcement. On the other side of the door, when you leave on the credenza, there are these packages. Please pick up one per person. And inside is a, let me see if I can get this in. Words neat when you read it. It's on the one side, it says Japanese American Veterans Association. On the other side, it's an image of the Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded to the United States soldiers. Again, as you leave, please pick up one as a gift from Java. Howard, do you have any announcements?
Before we close, please look at the back side of your program. It shows the schedule of what's coming up. Again, we're going to have a photo exhibit at the JICC. It's going to be a nice one. We'll have a special event at that location also. Okay. So this concludes officially today's event. However, before you leave, it'd be great if you could just mingle around, talk to a few people. I'm sure there are people here that you have not seen. Please introduce yourself. And I want to meet a lot of people here too. But before also, please stop by and say thank you to Nick very much. Thank you. Good, thank you very much. Drive home safely.